Hey, it's Michael Sapersky here, and what you're about to listen to is a past interview that I think you'll enjoy.
Welcome to the Consulting Success Podcast with your host, Michael Sapersky, where we take you deep into the world of elite consultants.
Hi everyone, it's Michael Sapersky here, and today I'm really happy to be doing this interview with Jonathan Bernstein of Bernstein Crisis Management. Jonathan is also the author of the recently released Manager's Guide to Crisis Management, published by McGraw-Hill. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Michael.
So you're the president of Bernstein Crisis Management. So let's start with, what is crisis management? I mean, it sounds pretty serious, but what does it actually mean?
Well, I sometimes get phone calls for what it's not. I sometimes get phone calls seeking my help in interceding with somebody with a drug or alcohol problem, for example. So there are actually a number of different types of crisis management. The type I work in is a specialty of public relations that's focused on helping organizations ideally prevent crises from happening, or in the event that they haven't been able to, helping them respond to crises in every way, both operationally in terms of business continuity and the ability to continue to maintain your organization's function, and also in terms of communication with all of your stakeholders, internal and external.
Right.
The best analogy really is firefighting, which everybody's familiar with. There's really two major elements to a fire department's work. Part of it is prevention. And the fire inspector will go around and say, if you move this barrel over there, you'll have a lower threat. And then, of course, there's the firefighters who go out and put out the flames and do their brave work. The people who actually save the most money are the fire inspectors, who quietly go about and help prevent crises from happening in the first place.
And so which one are you? Are you more the inspector, or do you play roles in all of them?
My business is pretty much 50-50 between those two. I mean, sometimes the phone call is, the fire is burning, help us put it out. But just as often, we'd like to do crisis vulnerability assessment. We'd like to do planning. We'd like to do training. And the plethora of crises in the news that in the past 10 years in particular have really woken up organizations, boards of directors to the need for crisis management. So the demand for prevention services, which used to be very, very low, say 15 years ago, has really rocketed in the last 5 years. Okay.
So today I want to learn more about this field, also how it relates to our listeners, and get some tips from you, as well as, find out how you built your business. And of course, I want to talk about your new book. So let's begin with, who actually needs crisis management? I mean, is it only for large companies, or do crises affect consultants and independent professionals as well?
Well, actually, ironically, it's the organizations who often probably have the hardest time coming up with a budget for it that need it the most. Because, if you're a $5 billion or $100 billion corporation, take in mind BP, for example, even with as horrendous a crisis as they had with the Gulf spill, they have the deep enough pockets to weather it. A smaller organization does not. And a single crisis significant crisis can just knock it out of business. A crisis is anything that is can be one of several things, or a mixture of them. It can be a serious threat to your reputation. It can certainly be, anything that's a threat to life, limb, and property. Anything that in any way undermines the value of the organization financially. All of those things, or any combination of things like that, can happen, and they interact with each other, because, for example, how you react, the fourth category is serious business interruption. So if you have a serious business interruption, but you communicate effectively, you'll have less of a crisis. If you don't, you'll have more of a crisis. So the different components of what constitutes a crisis interact with each other, and how you respond makes a difference as to whether you have a 2-day crisis or a 2-year crisis.
So Jonathan, let me just stop you there and ask you, really what you're saying is that a crisis can affect, a company of any size, whether it's one sole person, or
yes,
a few employees, or hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of employees. It's not so much the number of employees or the size. It's just, it depends. I mean, obviously the more people you have, the more potential risks there could be. But
Right.
any business that's connecting or has an interaction with customers or different industries or whatever it might be, has the potential to face some sort of a crisis. Is that correct?
That's correct. My business just faced a 5-day power outage here in Southern California due to high winds. Since if I don't have contact with my clients, I don't make any money.
That's a crisis.
And of course, as a crisis manager, I would be expected to be able to have backup plans. Imagine what would have happened if I had not been prepared and had not been able to continue business in some way despite the lack of power.
So did you have a good backup plan? Because you always hear that analogy of the the children of the shoemaker.
Yes.
They kind of go without shoes. So did you have good planning for yourself?
I did, but I also identified a vulnerability in my planning. I have redundant Wi-Fi access. I've got mobile hotspots. As long as I can power up devices, I'm good, and I have the ability to power devices from my car. And of course, you could go outside the affected area and go to a coffee shop and plug in and charge up there. So That's for the most part what I did. What I realized I should have had and didn't, and I recommend this for anybody, I plan to put this in my own newsletter, is a device that allows you to plug in to a car cigarette lighter and then charge any AC device, any device that has a plug in it, can be charged directly from your car. And I'm looking right at a lovely device from Duracell that I paid $50 for at Amazon that'll allow me to do just that. And has 175 watts of power.
Yeah, I mean, that would definitely be a bit of a shock these days. We're all so connected to electricity, and I know when the power's gone off in the office here or whatever, something is going on, it's quite a shock. It's almost like, what do you do now, especially if it's hit a region or a large area, and you kind of look out over the city. In this case, kind of looking over the city, and you see a bunch of buildings affected. It's a bit of a shock to the system.
Absolutely.
You've said about crisis management that it's more of an art than a science. Can you tell me why? Because my initial instinct would put me to think that handling a crisis and crisis management is very much a science. That there must be some sort of a formula and steps that you take. But you've said it's a bit of an art. So what's your thought on that?
Well, if it was a science, then there would be concrete steps that anybody could follow. And if you just do these steps, you'll produce the correct end product. So like putting together a medication or putting together a batch of hydrochloric acid or whatever you're going to do in a science lab. But if that was so, nobody would need me, frankly, which would be sad, but I'd have to have a different career. But there is a tremendous amount of intuition involved and creativity involved in effectively managing a crisis. And while there are certain steps that need to be followed, being able to and both anticipate what's going to happen next and properly prepare for it is an intuitive process, and that's where I draw the analogy with what an artist does. It's just it is a creative process as well as a step-by-step methodology process. And I would guess that if you tested people in my profession on one of these standards, psych testing, you'd find very high scale of intuition score.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, okay. I mean, when you put it that way, that definitely makes a lot of sense. That it's not just it's not a cookie cutter, straightforward process all the time. You have to be open to a lot of other things and be creative in your approach depending on what the crisis might be. Right. So I want to get to know you, Jonathan, a little bit more. So let me ask you, how did you get into this business? I mean, was it right out of school? Did you just decide in university or high school, I want to be in crisis management, or how did you get to where you are?
Well, I guess in hindsight, synchronicity. I've had 3 careers. First of all, I was a child of the 60s who was absolutely directionless at that point, and was 1969 high school graduate. And I went to university initially because that's what my parents expected me to do, but I was lost. I changed my scholastic majors, I think, 4 times in a year and a half. And I just didn't know what I wanted to do. and dropped out of school. So I didn't start out with a particular direction. Ended up getting married very young and started my first career just in my late 20s in the U.S. Army. And I was an oxymoron. I ended up in military intelligence. And it was an intelligence work. I ended up spending 5 years doing that because I enjoyed the work. It's where I learned initially how to assess vulnerability. In this case, we were assessing the vulnerability of the enemy, which was the big red machine. It was the Soviets and the Chinese and so on at the time, and in the Cold War days. And I also learned how to anticipate our own vulnerabilities and how to plug the holes in our own vulnerabilities.
So how did you go from being in the Army to deciding that you wanted to be in the field of kind of crisis management and public relations?
Well, I was a great fan of while I was in the service, I was a great fan and reader of a then very famous investigative reporter and columnist by the name of Jack Anderson, who worked out of Washington, D.C. Okay. And I decided initially I wanted to become an investigative reporter. And I contacted him and landed a job with him immediately coming out of the service. I'd also completed my degree while in the service in speech communications, but I thought at that point what I wanted to do was journalism, and in fact that's what I did for another 5 years. But how a lot of people got into the field of PR back then was out of journalism. I got a PR job in '82 that threw me into crises with my first employer, who was Playboy Corporation. Right. And they had a lot of bad news in their first year, and I found myself adept at handling that. So I volunteered for that type of work when I went over to PR agencies after Playboy laid me and half of their workforce off. And I by 1989 at PR agencies, that's all I was doing full time was crisis management. And then Reuter Finn, the international firm, headhunted me away to start their first crisis communications group in '89, and I ran that to '94 and decided I wanted to start my own consultancy. So okay,
so yeah, before you get into the kind of your own consultancy, I wanted to you mentioned something that stands out, which is that you're in the Army, and once you decide to leave the Army, you contact this guy. This was it Jack Anderson you mentioned?
Yes.
Okay, so. Now, did you have any kind of contact with him before, or were you just reading his stuff and decided, hey, I'm going to contact him? I mean, what transpired here?
Well, actually what I did was I got a hold of his unlisted home number because being in intelligence, I had access to information like that. And I called him up and I said, Jack, I'm Jonathan Bernstein with the U.S. Army Intelligence Agency, and I'd like to speak to you confidentially. And he thought I had a leak for him.
Right.
And so we then met in his Potomac, Maryland home, and I said, well, Jack, actually, I don't have a leak for you, although I think my knowledge of the intelligence world will be helpful to you. But I'm getting out of the service in 3 months and I'd like a job. And he said, you're hired. So that's how that happened.
Now that's, I mean, so from one point it sounds almost like you kind of scared this guy into meeting you, but, or maybe excited from what you're saying. But I mean, that's a big step, I think, and that's wonderful because, I've always been someone that's, when I have someone that I view as a mentor or look up to or I believe that I can learn from, I reach out to them, and I always encourage other people to do that as well. But there's a level of fear, I guess I could say, that a lot of people face when they consider contacting someone. They might read a book or an article or see someone on TV and think, oh, that's great, they're amazing, I wish I could learn from them, but obviously I can't, they're too busy, successful, whatever it is for me. But you actually when did that?
And I've had people reach out to me like that professionally, young people interested in getting into the field or a related field. And if they do it with a combination of chutzpah and politeness, I respond. And I've taken, lunch times and times on the phone and so on to talk to people because I believe it's part of my responsibility to pass on my knowledge. And I'm 60 years old now. I don't intend to continue to do this full time, at least the rest of my life. So, and there's another generation coming up behind me, including my son. So I'm interested in passing it on, but you have to approach people you have to study your subject and know what will work for them.
And so you're not just open to someone saying, hey, connect with me on LinkedIn, no personalization, let's just get to know each other, and, that doesn't work. They need to actually spend a bit of time learning about you, reading your website, showing that they care and that they understand, and
exactly.
that
it's the same thing as pitching a reporter for a story. If you're pitching, a PR 101, you have to research the reporter and know something about them. Nothing pisses a reporter more than being pitched on something they obviously have no interest in covering. So customizing the pitch, whether it's a job pitch or a media pitch, is always critical. So yeah, I encourage people to do your homework. And that's part of crisis management too, is I need to study if my client has an opponent that's causing them problems, criticizing them online or whatever. I need to study the opposition and understand what pushes their buttons.
Yeah. I think, there's still a lot that I want to cover here in this interview, but this one point is actually so valuable, regardless. I know it's not specifically related to crisis management, but just what you're sharing right now, and I think the value that people can take away from just this one concept is huge. But all right, let's get back to this. So, you mentioned that you were working for Rudderfin Inc., which is a very large public relations firm, and that they tasked you with the job of creating their crisis management division. But in 1994, you left that company to start your own business.
Yes.
So you now pretty much act, as a consultant, as an advisor to other firms. What made you choose back in 1994 to go out on your own, to leave, this world renowned company to start your own business?
I concluded both from my military experience and from my PR agency experience. At the end of the day, I don't play well with others.
Okay.
That's just me. I can do it very well for a limited period of time, so hence, client contact and so on. But I don't do well in large organizations with bureaucracies and reporting requirements and so on. I'm not cut out for it. And I recognized that I was going to probably at some point or another step in it more than usual and cause myself problems in that environment. So I decided all that, and the fact that I had an almost 3-hour round trip commute every day to go to work motivated me to want to commute mostly from my bedroom to my office, which is what I've done for the last 17 plus years. So that was a motivation. It wasn't, I was willing to take the risk. I did ask my existing clients, are you working with me because you want to work with me, or you're working with me because we're Rudderfin? Their answer was fortunately universally because you're you, and I didn't have a non-compete.
Okay, so you're able to get some clients.
Some business, but the nature of crisis management work is, while you may have ongoing clients, they only have active work for you periodically. So I did come out with some business, but I had to learn how to do business development.
And so when you went out on your own, though, what was the biggest challenge that you faced? So you had some clients that you were able to kind of get started with, but what was the biggest fear or challenge that you first encountered? I know we're going back now a few years, but if you think about that time, what was the biggest challenge for you? Well,
building a strong enough net. I already had a good network, but I knew I needed even a much bigger, much better network in order to guarantee a steady enough stream to pay the mortgage. And so getting that going effectively through a combination of internet-centered activity. I'm proudly a nerd. In fact, one of my clients is Craig Newmark of Craigslist, and he calls me an alpha nerd, and I'm very pleased with that title. And I've been online for a long time, for over 30 years. So I was one of the earliest people in the PR profession, I think, actively using the internet for business development, and research, but research even before them. Research as of 1982, but after browsers came around for business development. So I put a website up and started a newsletter very early in my own consultancy. I also started providing a virtual business before I think that term was coined, meaning that I'm kind of like the A team, or where I take my deck of cards of great consultants and I call on the right consultant for the right job, and I put together teams of top people, as opposed to the agency approach of you have one top person and a bunch of less experienced people on a team. Right. And And as the internet developed, that just became easier and easier to do. And, expansion to social media. And in fact, the expansion of the internet enabled me to pretty much stop doing some of the things I used to have to do a lot, which was go out to conferences and do speaking engagements, for example. That isn't nearly as effective for business development as a strong internet presence.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because, a crisis isn't always predictable. And generally when you think about doing business development, it's around, selling a service or a product that people have a need for currently. I mean, there's obviously life insurance and things like that, but how do you actually sell your services to a client if they don't know that they are going to need those services?
95% of my new business comes from my website. If you do a crisis management search, and I'm doing it as we speak, if you do a crisis management search on Google right now, first of all, one of my blogs, just to search top crisis management, and there's 24,900,000 results for the terms crisis management.
Yeah.
But one of my two blogs has the number 3 position on page 1 of Google.
Okay.
And my website has the number 5 position.
Right.
So they find me is the answer. They're looking for somebody, and the first consultancy they find is mine. And so I get a call, and even if they end up going and calling others, at least I'm included immediately for consideration.
So what you're saying though is that the majority of your business isn't necessarily pitching to people that don't know that they need crisis management services. It's people that already have identified that they need those kind of services, or they may need some assistance, or they're assessing it, or evaluating it, and they're doing the research, and then they're coming to you because you're taking the time, and you've done so obviously for many, many years, to build your credibility, to build your authority, to establish yourself as a thought leader in that area. And so people just find you.
While we work with a lot of seasoned and experienced consultants here at Consulting Success, I'm often contacted by new early stage consultants. Invariably, the question I'm asked is, what are the steps I should take to become a successful consultant and grow my consulting business to my first 6 figures per year? Well, I'm excited to announce that we've opened the doors for our Momentum program. This is our most popular program for early stage consultants, and it has helped almost 1,000 consultants to start, run, and grow successful consulting businesses. It gives you the step-by-step plan to help you with your messaging, your fees, and pricing strategies, how to win more proposals, how to go to market more effectively, developing a marketing system to generate leads consistently, and so much more. And right now, until September the 19th, you can sign up for Momentum and get 50% off the regular price by going to consultingsuccess.com/audio. That's consultingsuccess.com/audio, AUDIO. Only 100 spots are available to join Momentum and get 50% off. This deal is only available until September the 19th or until all 100 spots are gone. We won't be opening up new spots in this program for several months, so don't wait. Go to consultingsuccess.com/audio. That's consultingsuccess.com/audio, AUDIO.
Partially, yes, and that's most of the case. However, I do use outreach through my education material.
Okay.
My newsletter constantly talks about different crisis management principles and practices. It has a good subscription base. My blogs constantly talk about it. They have a good viewership, so that if you're under somebody's, and of course my publications, my original Keeping the Wolves at Bay and the newest one, The Manager's Guide to Crisis Management, if you're under somebody's nose and constantly educating them, then when their threshold of awareness raises to the point of, oh, that's a good idea, we should do planning and training. Well, who are they going to call? They're going to call the person who raised their awareness.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more with you. That's something that I always recommend as well. The whole focus on education through marketing is much more effective than just,
yes,
marketing, through pushing and things like that. I've done
cold pitching. When business has been slow, I've done cold pitching to various industries and so on. The rate of return, with some really good lists sometimes, but right, the rate of return is extremely low.
And so how is your business doing right now? I mean, has your business been able to provide you with, what kind of lifestyle has it been able to provide you with?
Well, I live in one of the nicest communities in Los Angeles County, in a not good sized home on a good sized piece of property. And, we just came back from a 2-week Costa Rica vacation, which when you're self-employed, taking a 2-week vacation without working is a luxury. And so the answer is a very good one. That said, there have been tough years. There's no, it's had its ups and downs. If you had to chart it, it would be certainly a line would go upwards on a curve. And this last year has been the best. It was 50% better than the previous year and the best year in my 17 years in business. So.
And can you talk, for a minute about maybe one instance or one year where it was really challenging? I mean, how many years back would you have to go to hit one of those years that was really challenging? I mean,
5 years.
Okay. And so you were, at that point, you were in the business for 12 years, but you hit a really tough spot.
Yeah, we had upgraded our home. We had moved to a more expensive home. We needed more space because one of my sons moved back in with me from previous marriage, and we moved at the top of the market here in California and at the height of the economy.
Right.
And so we bought a fairly expensive place with a bigger mortgage, and then the economy tanked and the real estate market tanked, both of course related to each other.
Sure.
And during that 1 to 2 year period, there were definitely months where, I thought I was going to have to call the mortgage company and say, look, we can't pay this month. And our credit card bills went way up and things like that. So it was tough. We got by, but if it had kept going the way it was, and also my client base cut off, what I think they perceived to be elective work, which is the preventative work. It's the training and the planning and so on. In other words, a breaking crisis was still a breaking crisis, and I would still get those calls. But,
right.
40 to, maybe about 40% I took about a 30% overall reduction in income for a couple of, almost 2 years, 18 months to 2 years. And yet my lifestyle had been keyed to the higher level. Mm-hmm. And so that combination of circumstances was, a lesson and a necessary pinprick to my ego, I suppose, of my over-optimism, because I tend to lean towards being overly optimistic.
What were the lessons that you kind of took away?
The biggest lesson, better to live below your means, which everybody knows is common sense. But, everything had gone so well for a number of years that, like everybody else, I thought it was going to continue to go that well. And, so lesson learned, I won't do that again.
And what kept you going during those times? And when things were tough, it sounds like there must have been some sleepless nights and some very, stressful situations. Some people.
See, I have, a core part of, and this is, I think a lot of people out of my generation have come to, by whatever source, a newfound sense of spirituality, frankly, and I have a sense of a higher power in my life. I'm not a religious person in any way, shape, or form, but, I knew that at the very worst, I would have a roof over my head and food on my plate, and my family would be cared for. And the worst case would be I'd have to give up this house and move to something smaller or rent something. But, there are people who, around the world who, don't have anywhere to live and don't have any food. So, all my problems were what I call luxury problems. They were not survival problems. They were luxury problems. And I recognize that. So I didn't lose a lot of sleep over it. I did my best every day. I didn't work extra hours because it just stressed me out. I'm not a workaholic. I like to take time off. And, if I did my best every day, the results weren't up to me. They were, that's beyond me.
Right. That's a great way of thinking, but I know I was doing an interview with Elise Bennon from Marketing Mentor a while back, and she mentioned something, similar, that when times get tough, you just have to kind of put things in perspective and look at yourself, look at the world around you, and, really how bad are things. And when you put it in perspective, often not as bad as you first think they are. So
no, North Americans tend to be very spoiled, in the U.S. and Canada. It's compared to, my dad was a career foreign service officer, so I was raised largely in two third world countries, in Nigeria and also Korea. And Korea, the 9 years after the Korean War, was still very much a third world country. So you actually saw the kids with the swollen bellies, and starvation and disease while you're rolling by in your air-conditioned diplomatic limousine. There was an 8-year-old staring out the window looking at these kids and saying, "Oh my God, I knew at 8 years old how good I am." And so, very few Americans or Canadians get to see that unless you travel to countries like that. And,
for sure.
Once you've seen that, or you choose to go down to the inner city in a lot of our major metro areas, you don't appreciate what you got. So even when power went out here for 5 days, power outage, that's a routine happenstance in even second world countries, much less third world countries.
Yeah, certainly. We have readers, listeners, customers from all around the world, so I think many of them will be quite pleased to hear you say that, because I've heard that as well, and it's quite clear that in North America a lot of things are taken for granted and aren't really put into perspective. So that's great. You mentioned one thing about when having to adjust your pricing, or kind of be a little bit more flexible during those tough times. So I want to ask you, how do you approach pricing? What kind of rates do you charge, and how do you set up your pricing structures with clients?
Well, traditional PR agencies have to price to cover the cost of their infrastructure, not just the cost of their personnel. They're paying for brick and mortar. So I recognize that actually a competitive point for me in some cases was that I didn't need to charge what Reader Finn would have charged for me. And I was, it didn't take too much research online to find out what or even by word of mouth, to find out what a Reader Finn or any major agency would charge for somebody with my experience at any given point in my career. So, for example, right now I know that a major agency would charge no less than $425 or $450 per hour for my time.
Right.
And up to 600 or 650%. So if my billing rate to a corporation is $325 an hour, which it is, or to $250 to a not-for-profit, that's a very competitive rate. So that's really how I reach my decision. And then, like any organization, if you're doing projects, you figure out the number of hours it's going to take, and you multiply it by an hourly and come up with a figure for them. So
do you often do work on an hourly basis, or is the majority of your work project? How does that work?
Well, breaking crises or spot consulting, just a quick phone call, that's all hourly.
Sure. Okay.
Stuff like media training, that's a fixed amount of hours. I know how long it's going to take. That's project work. Or creating a plan, which can be a little variable in hours. We might agree on a not to exceed ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
Those three options usually.
Okay. Yeah, that would make sense. So let's talk about your book now. Mm-hmm. You've just published your new book, A Manager's Guide to Crisis Management. Again, this is published by McGraw-Hill. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, how has writing books helped your business? Have you seen any direct impact from publishing books?
Well, my first book, Keeping the Wolves at Bay, I self-published.
Okay.
And yes, I've seen a very direct impact. It's been much better for revenue to my business than revenue from the book, although the book has made good revenue.
Right.
It's more that, because I use it two ways. One is, if somebody has that book in their hands and they paid for it, if they're going to need media training, who are they going to call? Or they're going to need, they already know who I am. But the other is, I've used both this book and the new book as a business development tool. So I will send it to somebody free, because It doesn't cost me very much as the author for either of the books. And I'll send it to them and say, and I enjoyed meeting you, or, if you'd like to see an example of my thinking, here it is. And that's landed me a lot of work. So that's the biggest value of it, is that, and is for business, as a business development tool. In both cases, it's the revenue I'm never going to be able to retire on revenue from books, but not even though the self-published one has a real nice profit margin built in, it's still, and of course with a major publisher like McGraw-Hill, thank you McGraw-Hill for coming to me and asking me to do the book, but the amount I actually make as an author with the major publishers is very tiny.
Right. Okay. And
I got in advance. Thank you. That was good.
That was good. So, okay.
But it'll take a long time before the royalties exceed the advance.
Right. So let's dig into the book then for a second. Can you share some tips from your book? I guess, one big question is, when a crisis occurs, what are a few things that you should definitely not do?
Well, the first thing you shouldn't do is shoot from the hip. There's a tendency to, or the other extreme from that, put your head in the sand. Mm-hmm. The ostrich syndrome. Actually the particularly the ostrich syndrome, because people, they put their head in the sand, they forget what part of them is still sticking out. And that's how I like to put it. It's in fact one of the image that's reproduced in my first book and in my newsletter is called Oh No, the Ostrich, and he's got a big target on his rear end, because that's what happens. But the other is they just tend to come out, someone criticizes them, they just come back and criticize them. They just come back and fight it right, say on a blog where they've been criticized. They'll come in and make a nasty comment right there. Well, all that does was optimize that post so it'd be found more easily. So it's there, and
let me just actually stop you there. What do you mean by that? So you're saying that if someone posts a comment or writes a post about, let's say they purchase a product from you and they're not happy with it, and so they write a negative review, and then you as the owner of that product come in and kind of attack their review, that's, you're saying that can help to increase the search rankings for that?
Yes, because a key thing for search engine optimization is relevant search terms. Well, if your name is mentioned once, that's one relevant search term. If it's mentioned twice, then it's twice. Right. And you just optimize that site further for your name, which means that ultimately in a Google search, that site will show up higher than a site where your name is, say, mentioned only once. So there are some strategic considerations involved, like there are certain sites that allow businesses formally to respond, and they do it in a way that can actually help you. But you have to know the peculiarities of each, if it's a formal complaint site as opposed to somebody's blog. But if I have a disagreement with my air conditioning company and I start a blog called airconditioningripoff.com, which by the way I threatened to do once. Okay. And, the repairman showed up right away when I did that. I don't know why that was, but if I did that and they posted a comment in response on my blog, the one that I owned, I would say thank you, because they just further optimized that blog for their name.
Right. So I remember actually reading an article about this exact issue, that there was, I can't remember which company it was, but one in the kind of the web sphere, Web 2.0 type business. I don't know if it was Groupon or it was some company that did this, and there was a lot of kind of negative publicity that went into it, and that helped to increase the search ranking. So I'm familiar with what you're saying, but I think it's also important to mention or to clarify what you start off by saying, which is that you do not recommend that people go and do that and try and get, kind of add more gas to the fire.
No, with great intention, there's a whole chapter in the book on online reputation management.
Right.
Because you cannot do effective crisis management in the year 2011 without understanding the role of the internet on crisis prevention and crisis response. It is an absolute, in fact, I've got an upcoming webinar on that subject as well. It's absolutely critical that people understand that topic. Without that, everything else is lost, because the internet has played a role in every crisis, not just some, every single crisis to which I've responded for the last 5 years at least. The internet has played a role.
Right, I think it's page 91 of your book is the role of SEO in online reputation management.
Yeah, and it goes, and that's well into chapter 9, which is that chapter on online reputation management. But the number one thing is the organization has to stay. If you don't already have a plan in place, for responding. If you have a breaking situation, you don't already have a plan in place, you don't have trained personnel in place, then the first thing you need to do is get somebody who knows what to do. It doesn't have to be me, but you need to have somebody who knows what to do, because they don't teach this in business school. They don't.
So I want to get then from you, because, a lot of our listeners here, some of them, may want to reach out to you. Others may just, may not find it financially viable. And I would think, and I know from, looking at your book, there are some things that kind of even a small,
yes.
Firm or a consultant can do to prepare, or, continuing on with this kind of the idea of a crisis has occurred, how to respond to it. 'Cause we now talk about how not to respond to it.
Right.
But can you give us a few tips that, that a small company or an individual can do if, let's say, a crisis does occur with their business, how to respond to it or what to keep in mind?
Well, what they need to do, first of all, is, I call it doing an out-of-body experience. You have to think about who's being affected by this and what are they going to think about. And communication is probably the core function in a crisis. So you need, what do you need to be saying to people, whether it's your employees, your customers, if you have any investors, whoever your vendors, what do you need to say to them to reassure them? A. B, you need to consider, there's 5 tenets of effective crisis communication, no matter who you are, 5 rules. The reason there are 5 rules is because I made it the list, but the 5, you need to be prompt, because in the absence of communication, rumor and innuendo fill the gap. You need to be compassionate. If you don't take into consideration the feelings of those who are affected by the crisis, they're not going to listen to the facts. You need to be honest, and that includes not exaggerating, not understating, not lying by omission, as well as not just directly lying by commission. You need to provide some means of people talking back to you and giving you feedback. You need to be interactive. And you need to provide them with at least the minimum necessary information. If you don't do those, if you do those, I can, when I'm asked by the media to assess how any crisis has been managed, I use those 5 categories.
So let me just review them quickly for our listeners here. So you mentioned prompt, yeah,
compassionate, honest, interactive, and informative.
Perfect. Okay.
And the other thing, small businesses, and I used to, I used to be very involved in a small chamber of commerce, and most of the businesses were under 5 people. You can team up together in advance. You can get together with other businesses and reach agreements with each other that'll help you continue business in the event, say, of a power outage. You can agree that, hey, if we're washed out by a flood over here, can we use your back room, Joe? And Joe, if something happens to you, a fire in your building, you can come over and use our back room. You can reach cooperative agreements on buying emergency supplies together so that they're cheaper. You can even reach cooperative agreements with other small businesses for both emergency response and for communications, so that if your business goes down, maybe you can use their space. If their business goes down, they can use yours. You can cooperate on buying emergency supplies. You can even cooperate in hiring a small PR firm to help you out. So if you by forming a co-op, if you will, a crisis management co-op, small businesses can gain more of the strength of the larger business.
Right. Well, those are great tips. So I'm just looking at your book here. There's 16 chapters, but one chapter, anyone that's listening to this and feels that, they want to learn more about the business of crisis management. There's a whole chapter 14 is called Crisis Management Consultants, looking all at, how do crisis management consultants operate, so you can learn a lot from there as well. The book itself, again, is the Manager's Guide to Crisis Management. And Jonathan, where can people find out more about the book? If they want to learn more about it, if they want to buy it, where should they go?
Primary 2 places are Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com. Both have it, and I know it's going to be coming into regular retail stores too. I don't know if it's arrived there yet because it was just published in November.
Okay, so yeah, that's Manager's Guide to Crisis Management by Jonathan Bernstein. And Jonathan, if people want to, to reach out to you personally, or have questions, or whatever it might be, what would be the best way for them to do that?
just email Jonathan@BernsteinCrisisManagement.com.
Okay. And so your website is BernsteinCrisisManagement.com?
Right. Or they can just do a Google search for crisis management. They'll find me pretty quick.
Yeah. As I said, you got good SEO going on, so that'll work well. Well, Jonathan, again, thanks so much for taking the time to do this interview. It's been really informative, and I think you've offered a lot of value and a lot for people to think about. So again, really appreciate it.
Appreciate it myself. Thank you.
Are you ready to take your consulting business to the next level? Learn more about the Accelerator Coaching Program at consultingsuccess.com.